Good evening and welcome to this year's H.G. Brennan lecture in economics and theology, which will be given by Dr. Catherine Fontenay on the topic of economics and selfishness. Before I go any further, I wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on tonight, and recognise any other people or families with connections to the lands of the ACT and surrounding region. My name is Jonathan Cole, and I'm the Director of the Centre for Religion, Ethics and Society, and also Associate Director of Research at the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture, both of which are proud sponsors of tonight's lecture, and also a related workshop, the H.G. Brennan Workshop in Economics and Theology, that's going to take place over the next 2 days. That workshop is going to gather together about 20 theologians and economists for a dialogue. There will be some academic papers discussed and a dinner. Each year we have a different theme. And this year's theme for the workshop is usury and financial regulation. It's way more exciting than it sounds, I promise. Typically at this point in proceedings, the person that opens would introduce the guest, but I'm actually the speaker. I'm actually going to introduce the person who's going to introduce the speaker. And that person is Professor Ian Harper, who is a member of the organising committee of the H.G. Brennan lecture and workshop, along with me and Professor Paul Olsington. I'm looking for Professor. What are you doing all the way up the back? All right, yeah, looking up at the back. And Paul is a research professor at the Centre for Religion, Ethics and Society, and they've both been involved in this project for a long time. Ian has had an incredibly distinguished career in Australia as an economist. A couple of the wow factors for me in his CV, if I can put it like that, is he's a member of the board of the Reserve Bank of Australia. He's a former economics professor and dean of the Melbourne Business School at the University of Melbourne, and a partner at Deloitte. It's a sort of digger station menu from your CV, Ian. I've also asked Ian just to say a couple of brief words about who Geoffrey Brennan was, whose memory we honour by naming the lecture and the workshop the H.G. Brennan lecture and workshop. So Ian, if I could invite you to do your part. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, good evening, everyone. Let me add my welcome to Jonathan's as one of the organisers of this event. It's just marvellous to see this room absolutely full of people come along this evening with good reason to hear my colleague Catherine de Fontenay, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. As Jonathan said, it's a pleasure to be able to just say a few words about Jeff. I think I scored this job because I know both tonight's speaker, I have done for some time, and the late Professor Geoffrey Brennan was my first head of department when I studied for my PhD at the ANU some years ago. So I knew them both very well. Tonight's lecture, and indeed the workshop, as Jonathan has said, is named for the late Geoffrey Brennan. And it's with particular pleasure that we acknowledge Margaret, his widow, who's with us this evening. And it was Margaret's, with her permission, that we were able to name this lecture and also the workshop in Geoffrey's memory. One of the things that distinguished Geoff Brennan is that he was very well known and very highly regarded by three quite separate groups of scholars, well known amongst my economist colleagues as a distinguished professor of economics and having published works with at least one Nobel Prize winner to my knowledge, holding academic positions in the United States, of course, and here also at the ANU, was one-time director of the Research School of Social Sciences at the ANU, so he rose to very distinguished positions in administration as well as in academia. But he's also very well known to the philosophical communities, the philosophers, of which I believe there are a number here present this evening, and to theologians. So a very distinct, widespread reputation and influence that Jeff had during a remarkable career. But one of the things that Jeff loved most was active discussion about issues. And of course, with economics and philosophy and theology, there was no shortage of issues that arose right, on the margins of all of those three very different ways of thinking about the world. And Jeff loved nothing more, frankly, than to have a good old ding-dong conversation It was on that basis that we conceived the workshop. Jeff, of course, himself was part of the establishment of the workshop, and he used to attend with gusto every year until his passing, and again, as I say, with Margaret's agreement, we've continued that tradition. The addition to this lecture, of course, is not something that Jeffrey saw, and he would have been, I suspect, embarrassed to have a lecture named in his honour, but you can see, I think, why we've done just that. So it's with love and with deep respect that this evening we will hear from a wonderful economist in Dr. Catherine de Fontenay in memory of H.G. Brennan, the late Geoffrey Brennan. Now to Catherine. So I've known Catherine since 2001. She came to Melbourne Business School, in fact to a joint position between Melbourne Business School and the Faculty of Business and Economics across the park, as we say, at Melbourne from the University of New South Wales, where she came straight after her PhD. She completed her doctorate in 1998 at Stanford University in economics, and then, as I say, came to New South Wales. Her father, the late Patrick de Fontenay, had visited ANU and visited Australia some years before, and so Catherine had been in Australia when she was 10 years old, but that was the only other association. She came here to join us and has never gone back, basically. She now lives in Melbourne, and you'll hear in a moment what her current association is. So she came, as I say, from New South Wales to Melbourne with her Stanford PhD. Catherine is, in my experience, not just exceptionally well trained as an economist, but she's a very thoughtful and compassionate, not just person, but economist. And her work has spanned quite a remarkable set of disciplines within economics, industrial organisation, development economics. She wrote a wonderful PhD thesis on development issues in South America, and competition economics. And unlike me and a number of my colleagues, this lady has published in other venues, including the American Economic Review and the Rand Journal of Economics. Catherine is a very distinguished member of our profession, and it was such a pleasure when she agreed to give us this lecture this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Catherine was appointed a commissioner at the Productivity Commission in 2019, the Brennan connection, when Michael, Geoffrey and Margaret's son, was the chairman of the Productivity Commission. So she was appointed in 2019, and she's now in her second term, so she was reappointed by the Treasurer to her second term. She's done a wide range of things, as you might imagine, but she's led research in particular on income inequality and mobility, healthcare productivity, and digital technologies, a range of things that she's interested herself in, and led the debate within the Commission on those subjects. Again, unsurprisingly, the breadth of her understanding, knowledge, and learning is now brought to bear on public policy, which is a wonderful thing for us as Australians. I'm also delighted to say that Catherine and her husband Ross and I are co-parishioners at St Jude's Anglican Church in Carlton, where she worships, and we have a number of different congregations at St Jude's, one of which is a mission or outreach to the estates ministry, as we call it, the high-rise buildings, if you're familiar with that part of Melbourne, on Lygon Street, where there are a lot of refugees and others who come, their first taste of Melbourne or Australia is to be living in one of those high-rise apartments. Well, St Jude's has had an outreach to that community for a very long time, and Catherine and her husband Ross have been heavily involved in our outreach to that work as well. Hence the compassion that I referred to earlier in my remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I now invite Dr. Catherine de Fontenay to deliver this year's H.G. Brennan lecture on the topic of economics and selfishness. Would you please welcome Catherine?
Thank you so much, Ian. I am overwhelmed and not a little intimidated by this crowd. I'm not a theologian and I'm not a philosopher, but to paraphrase C.S. Lewis, if you've invited an economist to speak, I can only imagine that you want to hear what an economist has to say. So now you're stuck with it, so good luck with that. Economics is on the nose with everybody and has been for quite a long time. So in 1945, it was famously described as the science of greed, And there are many other descriptions that are even less complimentary than that. And so it's worth asking why it has such a dark reputation among other social sciences and among the general public. One reason is just our area of interest. So on the empirical side, a lot of the economics literature studies how agents respond to incentives, financial incentives and other incentives. There's a particular literature that even examines how they respond even when that response might be very unethical. And so that is not necessarily approved of when you sort of pop the hood on less attractive aspects of human behavior. And broadly speaking, the empirical literature has identified kind of two reasons why you might get unethical behavior as a result of providing financial incentives. So one is if you provide financial incentives and they, like honey, attract unethical, unsavory characters. So for those of you that are not from Victoria, we had what is colloquially known as the vet fee help disaster, where a number of unethical providers entered the market for vocational education and were misleading students, essentially rorting the government, and it was a very unpleasant episode. More recently, we've had a parliamentary inquiry into employment services, so that's again a market that people can enter and offer employment services to job seekers. Some employment services are offering training to the job seekers that they are helping, and that training turns out to be not at all useful to these poor people that are searching for work. So we do see that when we offer financial incentives, sometimes it attracts people that are willing to behave unethically. More disturbingly, sometimes we find that we see unethical behavior among people who consider themselves nice and who we as a society tend to consider nice. So there's been a fair bit of work on doctors and how they respond to incentives. A couple of papers looking at the United States when different states at different times have allowed pharmaceutical companies to offer catering to doctors to take them out for meals. And this has been shown to affect the prescribing of specific medications that those pharmaceutical companies are promoting, increasing the prescribing of statins by 73%. So that looks unethical, right? Either you are under-prescribing beforehand or you're over-prescribing afterwards, but one way or another, that doesn't look great. And that one's a hard one because we do know a lot of wonderful doctors. We know that they work incredibly hard. It's uncomfortable when someone goes, oh, but look at your behavior over here, and kind of pops the lid on some of that less appealing side of human nature. On the theoretical side, we have a lot of economics has tended to postulate, has tended to start with a basic assumption of individuals motivated primarily by material self-interest, and then to think about, well, what would be the best systems to design to sort of protect society in a world where people are governed by self-interest? So you've seen quotes from Adam Smith, and essentially he was arguing that things such as market mechanisms have evolved so that we can allocate goods even as people are responding. The baker is engaging in his own self-interest when he is selling you bread. There's been work on government and on relationships inside firms showing that firms and government contracts can adjust to the presence of self-interested individuals. That we can put in place incentives, for example, stock options for executives, that will cause them to behave in a way that supports the firm. So essentially we are protecting the firm from self-interested behavior inside the firm. And the fascinating work of Jeff Brennan with James Buchanan has explored the theory of public choice. And their take on public choice is a fascinating one. Essentially it says, if voters know that government is full of self-interested people, we'll call them politicians, and what constitutional rules should we set up in order to protect us, society, from their more self-interested impulses? How can we design our voting and our rules so that we obtain outcomes that are good for society, even if government is full of self-interested individuals? So it's a fairly, I think you can say, dark view of the world. We think it's interesting, but not everybody agrees. So what I want to ask tonight is this worldview inherently dangerous? Is it dangerous to go around thinking of many people as responsive to incentives, as somewhat self-interested? Is that a dangerous worldview for us and for others? So one view is, meh, nothing to see here. These are just real forces. Selfishness is out there all around us. And so if that's real, and if it's powerful, and lots of this empirical work has shown that it's powerful, then we just need to grapple with that. And there's a great quote to that effect from John Stuart Mill, saying, the same persons who cry down logic will generally warn you against political economy. It is unfeeling, they tell you. It recognizes unpleasant facts. For my part, the most unfeeling thing I know is the law of gravitation. It breaks the neck of the best and most amiable person without scruple. If you are not selfish or hard-hearted already, political economy will not make you so. So John Stuart Mill doesn't think that there's a problem. However, you might ask whether there is some danger to going around thinking about people in these terms. And broadly speaking, you might think of two broad categories of danger. The first is, how does it affect individuals if we design systems that presume that they are selfish? So that is a very deep and interesting question that is probably best suited to the province of philosophers and maybe less to the province of economists. So I'm going to give you a few thoughts, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I am going to spend a little more time on the second question. How does it affect economists if we spend our time thinking about individuals and their selfish behavior? So, everybody good with that? So how does it affect the individuals that we design systems for if we are presuming them to be selfish? And government is full of a lot of economists, so this is not an abstract question. And then how does it affect economists? So, are there dangers to using market mechanisms? So how are individuals affected when we transact through market mechanisms rather than through other mechanisms, such as cooperative exchange? Now, we know that cooperative exchange is not free from self-interested behavior either, but are there things about markets that can be specifically harmful to the individuals that are involved? So a nice example is blood donations. There's a literature that has found that when we start paying people for their blood donations, the quality of the blood goes down. People are more willing to donate blood knowing that they have hepatitis or another serious problem. So the turning it into a market transaction has somehow damaged people's willingness to engage in this in a generous way. I think, again, this is way outside of economics. Now we're into theology, I think. My favorite reflection on this is a book called Life on the Vine by Philip Kennison. And he's talking about how do we cultivate the fruits of the Spirit, patience, love, generosity, self-control, in our modern world. And what are the things that work against that? And he has some worrying thoughts on how a world of market-style exchanges sometimes conflicts with love and makes it difficult to cultivate love in our lives and in the lives of those around us. As Ian mentioned, I go to the Estates congregation at St. Jude's, and so a lot of my fellow congregants are from the Carleton housing estate. And over the decades, it has been a constant struggle not to treat my time as more valuable than the time of my fellow parishioners, I'm ashamed to say. Why? Because the market value of my time is higher. That does not make it more valuable in God's eyes. There's a constant struggle. I really gotta go, Joanna, or a constant tacit view of myself as more important because of how the world has valued my market time. So that worries me, and I repent of it, but it happens again. And so I see the presence of the market creeping in a place where it doesn't belong. So that's one for us to think about, and I would value some help from the non-economists in that respect. What about those other categories, kind of using incentive mechanisms inside firms, using incentive mechanisms if we're government, procuring goods and services from firms. Australia is quite unusual in doing a lot of government procurement, so it's something we need to think about very hard. I would argue that we're on very much less dangerous ground whenever we're in long-term relational interactions. So if we work together, or you are my employee, or I am your employee, and that is a long-term relationship, what economics has to say about that and what other perspectives you might have, they tend to line up pretty closely. Economics says, well, in these types of situations you are in relational contracting. You're going to look at many dimensions of someone's behavior. You're going to reward all of those dimensions. If that person tries to exploit loopholes in your behavior, there will be consequences for that. A lot of what economics has to say and what you would expect from normal relating is not that different. However, when we start thinking about rule-based, short-termist interactions, treating people as self-interested gets a lot more problematic. And I'm mindful in particular of some work that the ANAO, the Audit Office, has done on contracts offered by the National Indigenous Australians Agency to various service providers in remote locations. And some of the problems with those contracts have been that sometimes they are very short-term. A very large share of those contracts initially were 1 year long, 2 years long, and so it was very transactional. Those contracts were very focused on compliance. Those contracts were very focused on measuring activity rather than looking at outcomes and seeing what, and they were not partnership. Right? And so the government has repented and has committed to work more in partnership with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community-controlled organizations to have something that looks much more like partnership, because that short-termist, output-oriented, incentive-oriented approach was very damaging. So I think that it is harmful in some contexts, and we need to do more thinking about that, and again, we could use help from theology and philosophy in that respect. On to the question of, so that's all I have to say on market and incentive-oriented exchanges, but I think it's a really important topic for research. On to the question now of how this affects economists. So does viewing the world in terms of incentives and viewing people as motivated by material incentives, is that bad for economists? So there have been some really interesting studies There have been a number of laboratory studies of the behavior, usually of students, because students are cheap to hire for the afternoon. And after a while, people started asking, okay, well, how do economics students behave relative to other types of students? And the results were, shall we say, a little disturbing. So, common pool games, which are sort of, how much would you contribute to achieve something that is beneficial to us all? So sort of, to kind of simulate when we contribute to, say, the well-being of our neighborhood or of other organizations. Economic students contribute less than other students. Ultimatum games, where you and I are splitting $10 and I can offer you a certain share. If I'm an economics student, I offer you much less than other students. Dictator games, where I can just decide what share you get. Now you get even less than before. They lie in what we call cheap talk games. In games of trust, they trust the other party less and they are less trustworthy. It's bad. It's all bad. So, of course, this led to a debate over whether this was nature or nurture. Are selfish jerks just attracted to economics, or does studying economics make you a selfish jerk? And that was an actual academic question. So the jury's still out on that one. There's no final answer. But interestingly, this paper, which is in a science journal, found that when you asked economic students about their beliefs and their motivations, the thing that really stood out, they still cared about fairness and all the things that normal people care about, but they expected others to behave selfishly, and in some sense that gave them license to behave selfishly. So in some sense, this world where you believe that people are self-interested is having an impact on economic students, which is a little bit of a worry. So, not looking great thus far. Definitely a little bit of a worry. And so, where do we go from there? Well, one way that we go is we broaden out what we think of, what we model in economics. And so, there is a large literature trying to develop richer models of human motivation. Again, trying to still find things with good explanatory power, but allowing for a much broader set of motivations. So there's a literature on altruism, there's a literature on families that allows you obviously to care about the well-being of your family, but there's also literature allowing you to care about others in much broader terms. Again, very materially focused. You care about the material outcomes for other groups, but still, this is much broader than the original models. And then, so things are broadening in a lot of different directions, but I particularly want to shout out to Jeff Brennan's amazing work on expressive voting, and then his work with Philippe Petit on the economy of esteem. So these are, what's fascinating about these is that unlike almost all of economics, they are inherently relational. They care about feelings, about how you feel about me. It's not purely about outcomes. I care whether you esteem me, not just because that will allow me to buy more goods and services. Inherently, I care how I am perceived by you and by other people that I esteem. So these are really fascinating, and he was unique in finding ways to incorporate that into our model that were both simple, beautiful, and powerful. So those are a huge contribution. And really everyone else, interestingly, has really struggled with everything that is relational. The other models of esteem, for example, Tirole and Benabou I am essentially playing a game with myself. I'm kind of trying to build up this person who is my vision of myself. It's not very relational. So I think his work is particularly remarkable that way. So that's been one direction. Economists are trying to broaden out and consider a much broader range of considerations. But it is true that in a lot of our models, we still consider primarily these kind of material self-interest of a lot of the parties in that we're looking at. So when we do write down a model, when we write down a theoretical model, when we either assume that people are selfish or we assume that they have a richer set of motivations, economists like to ask what we call positive and normative questions. We like to ask, well, what does equilibrium look like? When these parties interact with each other, what is the outcome? But we also like to ask, could we nudge this equilibrium in a better direction? If we were to change some of the incentives in this situation, would the outcome be better? So could we improve on what is happening? And even in the field of public choice, Jeff Brennan's, what would actors have to agree on in order to make that change? Interestingly, even on the empirical side, so economics has gotten much more empirically oriented in the last couple of decades, but even on the empirical side, we ask that question of, could this be better? What is first best, and could we get this system closer to something that is better? So what is first best? First best is essentially the outcome that a social planner would choose. So if somebody were standing outside of the system, making decisions for the well-being of everybody, what would that social planner choose? So for example, the Productivity Commission and many other economists have argued that in the case of carbon policy to reduce our carbon output, what we need is a uniform carbon price rather than policies that mean that the effective cost of emitting more carbon is different in different industries. It makes sense for it to be a uniform price. That's what a social planner would choose, is to have comparable cost across these different parts of the economy. So here's my question for you. In these types of models, in these types of empirical and theoretical questions, let's say we have self-interested agents, and we're asking these types of positive and normative questions about what a social planner would choose. Who is the economist? Who is the economist in these models? Is the economist one of these self-interested agents that they are postulating? Where do they see themselves in this picture?
They have to be seen to be the social planner.
Yes. Well, but they see themselves as the social planner. Perhaps because they care about what other people think. Yeah. The economist views themselves in this scenario as the social planner, the person looking in from the outside and deciding what is first best, what is best for others. So what's kind of interesting is that although we assume kind of a very self-interested motivation in others, the economist tends to have a perspective where they are asking, what is best for everybody? What is best for people in this market? What is best for people in this design of a new policy? What is the best outcome? So it is a little hard to believe for non-economists, but I do want to argue that actually love is a large motivating force in our work. We are primarily motivated by the welfare of those that we are thinking about, writing policy for, modeling, estimating. We are primarily motivated by love. So, the topics that we look at, the cost of crime, the policies that will motivate people to get back to work, the design of mental health services, all of these are policies where we have people's well-being in mind. That's not to say that so I don't think that selfishness is the besetting sin of economists. I think that the besetting sin of economists is pride. so envisage that picture where the economist is standing outside of the system, making assumptions about the system and making decisions about what would make things better for everyone in the system. And agents in the system are always modeled as having simpler motives than this economist who stands outside of the system. So it is a sin, and it is the original sin. We are literally putting ourselves in the place of God. My mother, when I was in university, asked me what my ideal job was, and I said, philosopher queen. And I feel that I have gotten pretty close. It is a real risk. I have not known many selfish economists, but I have known tons of arrogant economists. And it is a real besetting sin of our profession, that view, looking down at the little people making their self-interested decisions. So the good news is we have the well-being of others at heart. The bad news is there is a lot of pride and arrogance there in the mix, and it is an ongoing challenge for us. So how do we keep any humility? Well, I'd argue that where the humility comes back in is when you are aware that even as a social planner, the preferences that you are implementing are not your own. You are implementing the preferences of voters, the government, the preferences that arise from a democratic process. So for example, I just mentioned that a social planner would choose a uniform price of carbon. Everybody who emits carbon would be facing the same cost, and that cost of carbon would be equal to its social cost. Its cost to us as a society of having additional carbon. But what is that social cost? Well, society is going to have to come to a view about that. And it's not easy. It's going to be trading off what you think the risk of global warming is, what you think the likelihood is of us having a technological breakthrough in the next decade, and a number of other considerations. Society is going to have to decide what that social cost of carbon is. The economist doesn't get to decide. So the humility comes in if the economist can, and often they cannot, but if the economist can put aside their own view, and I promise you they all have a view on what the social cost of carbon should be. I won't do them the disservice of supposing they don't have an opinion, but can they put aside their opinion and implement the choice that society has made of what that social cost of carbon will be. And I'm constantly inspired by Michael Brennan, Jeff's son, in this respect. So when I worked for him at the Productivity Commission, he was constantly reminding us to not supersede the role of government. He would say, well, we can tell people, we can tell government what the costs and benefits of this mental health policy are. But we cannot tell them that they must spend the money on this policy. Government is seeing the whole picture. Government has to make those trade-offs between all the different competing needs. We cannot decide for them that this must be spent. And that was really inspiring. It really helped me remember that we are not the ones who make those decisions. So briefly now, I want to talk a little bit about some work that the PC did that sort of illustrates that point. So the Productivity Commission did some work on inequality and mobility in Australia. And we asked a number of questions which are, again, what we call positive questions. So essentially, what's happening there? What's happening to inequality? What's happening to mobility? What's happening to people in disadvantage? On the surface, they're all positive questions, but someone has to make a normative decision about, is this good? Is this bad? Do we have too much inequality? Do we have not enough? So income inequality in Australia has been rising gradually. The Gini coefficient, which is the one way we generally measure that, I won't bore you with how we calculated Gini, see me afterwards, has been rising gradually. And likewise, it's a little harder to tell for wealth, but the Survey of Income and Housing, which is a larger probably more accurate source, suggests that wealth inequality has been rising over time as well. Is that bad? Maybe. Society's going to have to decide how they feel about those levels of wealth inequality and income inequality. This is a fascinating picture. This is about the relationship between inequality and mobility, sometimes called the Great Gatsby curve. And what it shows essentially is that countries that have very high inequality also have very low intergenerational mobility, which is to say, if you're born in Brazil and your parents are wealthy, you will be wealthy as well. And if you are born in Brazil and your parents are poor, you will be poor as well. And so you can see the United States, my country, has quite high income inequality and low mobility. And there's Australia, kind of middle of the pack in terms of inequality, but very, very mobile relative to other countries. In fact, more mobile than several Scandinavian countries, which is a bit of a surprise. So that's the same data, but in sort of league table form. Here are different countries and their rate of mobility. Think less mobility this way when you have a higher rank slope. Your income and your parents' income is more correlated. So Australia looks very, very good with more mobility even than some of the Scandinavian countries, which is a bit of a surprise. And this graph shows, this is the share of children who earned more than their parents by parents' income decile. And surprisingly, if you're up here, if your parents were in the top 10%, only about 20% of you are earning more than your parents did. So it's not that vision that we sometimes hear in the newspaper of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. We're seeing at the bottom end, everybody has earned, almost everyone is earning more than their parents did. And relatively few people are earning more than their parents did at the top. So very interesting, kind of surprising. This is for people aged in the 1976 to 1982 birth cohort, so we don't know whether that mobility is getting worse over time. It's hard to measure it for younger people. And this is the share of children who end up in different income deciles depending on their parents' income. So here in the middle, if your parents were born sort of in the middle of the income distribution, you could be anywhere, which is kind of surprising when you think about it. Literally anywhere. You could be in the bottom decile, you could be in the top decile. Your parents' income has essentially no predictive power on where you're going to end up. We see more stickiness at the bottom of the income distribution. If your parents were in the bottom 10% of income, you're more likely to be in the bottom 10%. And at the top, we see a lot of stickiness. But again, if your parents were in the top 10%, about 20% of you are in the top 10% yourself. So there is some stickiness, but it's not actually nearly as much as in many other countries.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
I was a teacher for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
A daughter of mine was a lawyer for 5 years. But she earned twice as much as me.
Yes,
So it's already putting her way above.
it is, yeah, yeah. So she's got a lot of upward mobility relative to your income, yeah.
So I'm just sort of comparing all
That's
the
right.
other like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and the other thing that we see is that income mobility varies a lot by what state you are born in. And so, worryingly, if you are born in the Northern Territory, there's much less income mobility, probably because of the deep disadvantage of non-urban communities in the Northern Territory. If you're born in the Northern Territory, there's much less income mobility than we're seeing in the other states in Australia. So, on its surface, that doesn't look great. But in order to decide how we as a society feel about that, we're going to have to ask some values questions, and economists are not going to be able to answer them for you. They have to be answered by society, right? What do we want, and how much is it going to cost us in terms of income and growth, depending on what we want? Like, we probably don't want to be Brazil, because that's, that's bad for inequality, that's bad for mobility, and it's bad for growth. But closer in, then the trade-offs become more difficult. Do we want equality of opportunity for every kid to have the same opportunity based on their ability and motivation? But motivation is actually often driven by your family's circumstances. So do we want limits on how much inequality there is so that motivation looks pretty similar across different families? Do we want limits on inequality so that income and opportunities are still good at the bottom end of the distribution? One kid that I tutored on the Carlton housing estate was in a refugee camp, and she had very little short-term memory. So I taught her the same topics in math month in and month out. So if we reward people based on ability, that's not going to work out very well for her. But is that fair given her circumstances? Why do we allow for huge differences in outcomes based on ability? Do we want children of all backgrounds to have some chance of reaching all income levels, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same opportunities? Do we want to avoid bottlenecks? So we could have fairness just by screening everybody at 9 years old and deciding what opportunities you get. But we probably want a system with more second chances in it so that if you did something stupid in high school, you can still recover further on down the track. The part the economist can answer is, once you've told me what your values are, I can tell you the best way to achieve that and the way that will cost the least in terms of lost income or lost growth or tax burden. But I cannot tell you what the values are that we as a society should have. This is a picture of the Great Gatsby curve for math test scores. So this is a picture of how if you're, depending on the inequality of your family, how correlated are your test scores with your parents' income. So this is very disturbing. Essentially this says, in some countries, there's a lot of inequality, and it's very, very difficult for low-income children to do at all well in the school system. Right? So interestingly, in some countries, income makes almost no difference to how you perform in school. So is that the kind of equality that we want? We have to figure it out as a society. It's not obvious. But on the positive side, we ask questions about, well, what can we tell you in order to make those decisions? So first of all, in Australia, do we see signs? When we look at people over the course of their life, is it the case that are we seeing signs that people can get trapped in low mobility? That if they have a bad outcome, they can't recover from that. We see people with less education or less income more likely to slide down from their current income level. Is Australian society like a game of snakes and ladders, right? You're more likely to slide down if you're low income and less likely to climb up. Are you more exposed to negative shocks? Are you less able to recover from a negative shock? Those were some of the things we looked for in our research. This is a picture of people moving between the 5 income brackets, so highest 20%, next highest 20%, based on whether they earned a degree or a diploma, certificate, year 12, or less than a year 12. And again, it doesn't tell you everything, but at first glance, it doesn't particularly look like snakes and ladders. It looks like if you have a degree, it's hard to slide down from that top bracket once you find a position in the top bracket. But what's interesting is over here, you see people moving kind of all through the income distribution. It doesn't look as though you're hugely stuck if you're at the bottom of the income distribution. So that seems encouraging. It's not the full picture, but it's one snapshot. We took a look at what happens if you have a health shock, depending on your initial level of income. And what we see is that everybody is earning less after 5 years after a major health shock. But the impact is much, much worse if you start out from being low income than if you start out from being high income. Something we have to explore more. This could be about the nature of the work and whether you can do it while suffering from a health condition. But on its face, it looks like if you're starting out low income and you do have a negative shock, you're not really able to climb out of that. Other types of differences, we don't see much variation. If you lose your job, again, we can still see signs of that on your income 5 years later. Losing a job is a very serious outcome, but the outcomes look similar for people who live in a major city or a regional area, even though we tend to think there are fewer job opportunities in regional areas. So again, these are just snapshots, but we're trying to build an information base that allows us as a society to say, do we have the right level of mobility and inequality, or do we want something different? Let's skip that one. So in short, I don't think that selfishness is the besetting sin of economists. I think it's pride. I think we should be very, very afraid. I think it comes from a good place. It comes from trying to understand and influence people's choices for their well-being, but it definitely has great risks to it. And seeking to help to fully implement the preferences of the government, the voting public, is probably the right response to some of that. Thank you very much.